industry, a music producer seeking new techniques, or someone who simply wants to gain a deeper understanding of the music business, Music with a Twist is the perfect platform for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Music with a Twist. I have today with me Miss Natalie Jacobs. Welcome, Natalie, to the show.
Hi,
And
thank you.
now, Natalie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your company, and what do you do as a music industry professional?
Of course. So my name is Natalie Jacobs. I run a music metadata consulting firm called Equalizer Consulting. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, but I've really found a passion in metadata, especially as it relates to protecting assets, rights management, really helping make sure that all the musical creations are properly credited and tagged and able to receive the royalties that they deserve.
Okay, great. So, with that, how does your company operate on a day-to-day basis, with assisting music creatives? Do you just focus on middle managers, or how does it work?
Well, when it comes to my music creation side of the business, I'm really looking at working with middle and sort of smaller companies who really need a lot of input and assistance with setting up good data operations. And then on the other side of that, I found that musicians generally don't understand all the elements of the metadata rights ownership and management and how that works in the business. And there's good reason for that because it's really, really complicated. So I also very much approach it from an educational standpoint, and I will work with musicians directly to make sure they have all of the different elements in place, that they own their metadata, so they're not relying on a third party to give it to them, that they are registering with all the appropriate parties, both as an artist, but also as a songwriter, because I cannot guarantee that there is a royalty out there. I don't do marketing and promotions and things like that. But what I can do is make sure that any royalty that does exist is able to find its way back to them. And that's really important to me because I find that the independent musicians need so much help in that area. It's so complicated to navigate. And I'm really hoping to be able to move the needle by assisting them.
Okay, great. Now, that was a whole mouthful of information, and I hope for our listening audience, that they would take the time to dissect that and reach out to you or any other professional, that would be able to assist them, whether it may be a small company, a big company, or a musician, like you said. Now, based on metadata, why would you say that it is so crucial in the content of music distribution? And what exactly is metadata for those of our listening audience that may not know what it is?
Absolutely. So metadata is really how the information for the sound recording and the underlying musical work are identified. So it's going to allow proper attribution for the people that were involved in the creation. So that could be the artists, the songwriters, but also engineers, mixers, producers, session musicians, and so on. It also holds critical release information. So that can be a label. If you don't have a label, it can be, your own identifying self-distribution identity. It can also include things like release date, genre, which will also help with allowing your assets to be found, discovered by both by fans, but also by others in the industry. So let's say music supervisors and things like that. So really it's critical to try and get those elements of metadata all connected to the musical assets at the time they are distributed. It can be quite troubling to see in the industry how things don't always get updated. And this isn't an issue just for independents. Things can happen in the majors as well, where things don't necessarily get updated. So the ultimate goal, and something that I try and educate on, is to make sure that you have as much of your metadata locked down and accurate at the time you release something and distribute it out into the commercial landscape, because it's so much easier to take care of it up front than it is to try and track things down and update them after the fact.
Wow. So I know from my little experience, with metadata, because you're the expert, right?
Hmm.
I know when you get so far into this, you have to contact a lawyer, or how does it work? Because I know that you said that at the beginning it has to be accurate, to benefit the artists, distributors, and listeners, with metadata being beneficial.
You don't have to have an attorney to take care of your metadata.
Okay.
If you are getting ready to release something, there are going to be certain things that you will find through whatever your distribution platform is. They will encourage you to, of course, fill out the various fields. And whatever the fields are that they're asking you to populate, you want to try and make sure they are as complete and accurate and consistent as possible. So let's take an example of even two songwriters who are perhaps, splitting something 50-50. Those are all elements of metadata that they want to lock down early and make sure that they're in agreement on, so that when they register with their respective performance rights societies or their collective management organizations, they want to make sure that they're registering those things consistently. Because another element of getting that data wrong is either that you can't be found, a royalty can't find its way to you, or if you and a collaborator are not in agreement, then it can end up in a place of dispute, which means your royalty may end up getting held up until the dispute is resolved. So it's really, you don't need an attorney to do that. It's always good to have an attorney on your team who can vet information and make sure that everything is lined up and looking good. However, an attorney wouldn't necessarily help you with your metadata components. That's something that you could work with your business manager on. You could work with somebody like me who really has the expertise to see what's complete. Do you have your identifiers in place? Are you registering everything in the right place? But one thing I do find that is really important is that we do talk about it and we do educate about it, because music data in the industry is really not in great shape in a lot of ways, especially historical data. And it becomes very complicated to try and find the right people to pay, or to match, a sound recording to perhaps the musical work, which could be a cover, making sure everybody is properly credited.
Yeah, I completely understand that, coming from a developing country like the Bahamas, where I live and actually operate business, even though
Mm-hmm.
my business is US based, I know that that can be an issue, especially with persons, understanding the language, knowing what metadata is, making sure that their information is properly documented, like you said, understanding, how do you split the royalties, and mainly moving from that transition. And I want us to focus on
Mm-hmm.
that right now, that transition from physical to digital music distribution, because I know in our regions like the Caribbean or third world countries, and I
Mm-hmm.
know it still is present, in the US, but it may not be that prevalent like it is in the Caribbean. How
Right.
would you say the shift from the physical to digital music distribution impacts regions like ours, or it is still impacting, regions like yours in the US?
Right. So the shift into digitization of music, especially in emerging markets and sort of developing countries, it's, it can be a challenge for various reasons, because you also have to have the copyright infrastructure and the legal framework really in place to support how broader digital distribution is going to happen. Even in, the larger markets like the US and Europe, you have so many issues with how metadata is sort of moved around, and even for independent artists in those countries where there's a lot more information and education perhaps available. Um, and there are copyright and legal frameworks in place, it is still really difficult for people to understand all of the elements that they need to get in place. And there's a lot of balls in the air that they have to try and juggle to make their, the business end of their creations work. So when it comes to, emerging markets and developing countries where the information isn't necessarily there, they don't necessarily have the digital infrastructure with regard to spreading that information. They don't necessarily have the rehearsal spaces and recording studios where creatives can collect and actually discuss some of these items, or have those central bodies in place to distribute the right information. Those can really be challenges that it's also an opportunity, though, to sort of invest and create that central framework the right way as things are moving towards the digital space. So it's, it's an interesting time, because I think that when you've got somewhat of a sort of a younger slate of information that you can build upon, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but it does need to be done the right way.
Okay, so based on the right way, I know that, moving from the analog into the digitization, like you said, may be
Mm-hmm.
difficult, and it is an opportunity that we can harp or embrace on. Can you give us tips or ideas of how we can make this smooth transition to the digital distribution?
Yeah, of course. So I mean, there's I think that the government policies and regulations in the countries hopefully can be done in a supportive way, because there's a lot that can be learned from collective management organizations and so on in the countries that are more established. So for example, the World Intellectual Property Organization is an agency that works with the United Nations, and they are aiming to develop intellectual property systems across the globe. So, relying on those sort of central bodies who are able to show you what's working and show what's not working so well, I think that those are really important to lean upon and learn from. So within that is also promoting the education of the standards and the accurate metadata during the digitization. So as I said, getting it right at the beginning, that is a difficult thing to do, because a lot of people are very focused on the creativity and they just want to get their assets out there and into the world, but really promoting those educations and standards and how to get the accurate metadata in. And even when building perhaps local distribution platforms, taking some of those things into consideration and helping guide musicians as they are uploading information for distribution. So make sure that they're getting things input as best as they can. So creating those parameters that can be adhered to and broadly distributing the information is critical. But I also know that there's still challenges with even the infrastructure of broadband, or having websites in individual local countries that sort of explain these things, and having musicians even know that they can go there and get that kind of information. It is a lot of work, but I always hope to make it as clear and easy as possible to educate. And the more broadly we can educate, and the more broadly we can use those sort of central bodies to help us with that, I think that those would be very great investments for any developing country, because the globalization of music is such an amazing commodity.
All right, now can you repeat that last part for me just one more time? We were breaking up. You were breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
I'll just edit it.
yes. Apologies.
Yeah, sorry about
Yes.
that.
No, that's okay. So the globalization, I mean, putting an investment in those platforms and those systems that really support the local musicians, because globalization is such a big commodity now. So, the music that goes up into, a commercial release, it's not just local anymore, because of the fact that things have been digitized. It can go so far. It really is a global landscape.
Yeah, it is so great that you spoke about the global landscape, because thinking about your article that I read just a few days ago, where you spoke about the Anglo music and everyone not fitting under that genre, and the Grammy is just recently releasing a new branch of their awards where they now represent African music, and we have
Hmm.
the Latinos actually fitting into that, and it's not necessarily not being non-Anglo music. How would that actually be a representation now as metadata, focusing on taxonomy, and
Hmm.
actual tags, and connecting that with metadata now?
Of course. So genre is data. Genre, subgenre, the things that are used to categorize musical assets, those are also data. And so what's the wonderful thing about using some of those elements of data is that really honors the music and local culture, if it's done the right way. Because of course there can also be a lot of bias applied. So, for example, in the article that you mentioned, I was saying that the Grammys really, they do have sort of these more specific categories that they are adding, but they take two core genres for African music, for example, when of course there's hundreds of genres that could potentially be applied to African music based on the different regions and the different cultural heritage of those different regions. And so, there's a bias applied to that because everything is, you can't put everything under Afrobeats. That's not appropriate as a summary of African music in totality. So what really can be done in the local markets as well is honoring that heritage and looking at the different ways to represent genres and represent um, the regions through that. Because as these musical assets go out into the world globally, and there's a lot of growth in how musical assets are going globally. I think they're saying that the 2023, the world music market went up 26%.
Wow.
And there's a lot of unique and cultural sounds that are appealing to fans worldwide. You can look at how, something like K-pop or J-pop has really transcended far beyond the Asian market. When you are releasing from a more local, regional area out into the global marketplace, really being mindful of the genres, being mindful of the subgenres, the regions, the cultures, and really introducing that into the world in a holistic way so that it's appropriate and not just, a Anglo view based on one of the US or, European markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now I know you touched a lot on the cultural impact, actually explaining for our audience non-Anglo, and actually knowing what is Anglo music, and differentiating between the US market and new and emerging markets right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know right now it's so easy for the rest of the world to embrace these new genres or subgenres, and for sure we had the idea that it would have been difficult for other markets to actually digest what would have been new. No one really expected Afrobeats to be as big it is as it is
Mm-hmm.
right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that I didn't have the statistic for African music growth as a whole, but I was seeing that it's very prevalent, especially in Europe.
Wow.
Europe, there's a lot of outside of within Africa, Europe is probably the biggest area that is listening to African music. And similarly in the US, you've
Wow.
got a lot of growth in Latin music,
Mm-hmm.
especially. So, there's a lot of listeners outside of those particular regions and countries that I think it's also going to encourage more collaboration, especially as the digital infrastructure in emerging markets becomes more robust. It's so easy now for artists to send files back and forth. They don't have to physically be in the same location to be able to collaborate. So as these new genres and cultures and regional sounds are being introduced globally, I think it's going to be a really exciting time with different collaboration of artists in different regions who are able to sort of bring sounds together and really introduce to fans a whole new world, literally a whole new
Yeah.
world of musical sounds and fusion sounds. But I do think it is important to honor the origins as well.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to, really divulge on the how we don't have to actually take a plane or a boat and actually go to that physical location and record in the studio, right? You can actually make those merges right online.
Right.
And yeah, and based on developing countries, with leveraging these innovations and the enhancements that actually comes with this, how can we focus on new emerging trends, and how can that develop or benefit rather developing countries?
Right. I think that there's so many interesting ways that the developing countries can really use this to their advantage and, not only support more local musician communities, more consistent access to sort of broadband and internet. In the US, everybody has internet at home, and that is not the case in every country, right?
No.
So a lot of people here are able to produce, create, and do those things in their bedroom and release it out into the internet. There's a lot of apps that are mobile apps that you can play around with and, create music sort of on the fly. And there's so much availability for that. I think the emerging markets, as they hopefully start building that infrastructure and that community to bring musicians together, to give them a space where they can, if they can't necessarily do it at home, they don't have the broadband internet at home because they're in a rural part of, Indonesia or something like that, allow them to have those creative spaces where they can come together and they can create and they can potentially start developing sort of local apps that can be used. And so that sort of take that micro collaboration in their area and start bringing it out into the world. And things like that will also encourage, the formation of live venues, live events, potentially festivals. There's always, the potential of tourism that comes out of honoring music and culture. You think about a lot of people who are flying from different countries to go see Taylor Swift, so
Yeah.
there's you can absolutely turn it into something that really is a return on the investment spent to help facilitate the sort of the musical growth of community in a particular area or region. So there's a lot of things that have to be done to make it happen. But I do hope that, the governments in the different regions start really understanding the commodity that can come out of it. Because unfortunately, there are some areas where piracy is such a huge problem. I want to say it was Nigeria. I was reading about where piracy is such a big problem that some of the the larger companies have considered it non-viable. So you want to get ahead of that, right? And there's also, I think there is more investment coming from, the major companies that are looking at what's happening in these regions and are able to come in and offer some support and expertise and also assist with the growth. But yeah, it's something that if, like I said earlier, I think if done the right way and really looking forward and creating that sort of longer term plan, it could be so exciting and it could really just be an amazing time.
Yeah. I just recently saw in the American Society, I noticed like a lot of them have been going to Europe, specifically France and the UK, to enjoy Taylor Swift concerts
Mhm.
at other concerts of American artists. I'm like, okay, this is pretty cool,
Right. And
hmm
there's no reason it couldn't expand beyond that. I'm sure
Yeah.
that there would be people who would be thrilled to go see music at a festival, and everything that comes with that, it really can, again, it's that return on investment for the
Yes.
infrastructure in that area.
Yeah. So based on, what you touched on with governments and them actually being involved, and I know you talked about Nigeria and piracy being very big, and that actually being an hindrance for the development of Nigerian music in the country. How would you say that, government policies and regulations have a play in the modernization of music distribution in developing countries? How does that look for middle managing companies, small companies,
Hmm.
musicians, artists, in those developing regions?
Right. So I think that the government policies and legislation does take a huge part in the role of all of this, because if you don't have that framework in place, it becomes very, very difficult to collect and distribute, the royalties that are owed to the various partners, whether that be people who are on the artist side, people who are, on the publishing side. There really have to be some parameters with which to operate within. And those central bodies do play a huge part in making sure that everything is does have that standardization applied, the importance of metadata and the education, again, surrounding that, but also giving that framework that you can refer to and rely upon. So here in the US, we have, the Copyright Royalty Board, we have the Copyright Acts, the various sections of the Copyright Acts that apply to whether it be the artist's, performance, whether it be the collection of royalties for live venues, all of those things are really, the framework is there. And even in the US, it's still really difficult to navigate. It can be. There's a lot of different areas that an artist or a songwriter has to think about in order to get their stuff in place. But at the same time, those frameworks are at least there. So even if, a royalty is generated and the metadata isn't correct and nobody knows where it actually went, there are provisions in place to try and make sure that that royalty does route itself back to the right person, which kind of goes back to the importance of the metadata. But if you don't have that in place, where does something like that get managed? And what happens to those royalties? And if you can't put those collections and distribution processes in place with the legal framework to support them, then you end up in a position where I think musicians and distributors and other companies, labels, publishers, and so on don't really have the ability to operate properly. So therefore, that whole infrastructure starts falling apart again. And the hope is to encourage growth, not to sort of hamstring yourself at the beginning where you can't operate, or end up in a place of piracy where it becomes non-viable. So really, it does play a very important part in making sure that everything is set up and ready to move forward.
Yeah, now I know that you touched, a lot about how we can make this much more easier and more accessible, and how in certain
Mm-hmm.
regions it is very difficult, based on how the governments have everything set up and
Right.
how everything, trickled down and affects our local music, culture, and communities in the developing countries. Now, before we go, I just wanted to ask you, based
Mm-hmm.
on everything that you spoke about, what measures can be taken to preserve embracing digital advancements, and how can we access them, through the whole going forward with music tech? Does
Mm-hmm.
that have anything to do with music tech, or how does it all tie in with moving
Absolutely.
forward with music?
Yeah, it absolutely. Technology and music are so intertwined now. It's really important to consider the impacts of technology on music. and the advancements that are happening so quickly. Like I can hardly believe how quickly some of it is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So in a more sort of developing country, the uneven access to technology can, of course, be a problem. So, if you're in a rural area, you don't have access at home, whether you are a musician or a fan, it can impact on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of course, if you're a fan and you don't have consistent ability to stream music or just listen into music, and you're still got a lot of reliance on physical physical product as a result, that also can limit discovery. It can limit the ability to listen to all the many things that are out there in the world. So distribution in itself, the technology that allows people to distribute, is so easy now that really anybody can do it. But you do need things like a solid internet access to be able to spend the time to get the upload. You need to have the upload speed capability. So access to engineering tools to digitize, whether it's an existing musical asset or brand new one. The ability to make the high quality audio, so that as things are distributed into the marketplace, they are of a high enough quality that it's a good user experience as well. So really helping internet access for local communities to be able to build, allow artists to be able to connect with fans, because online platforms are so huge in that. If you look at social media, you look at, it could be TikTok, it could be Instagram, it could be something more local, Patreon, whatever it is, having that internet access so that artists can make those connections with fans locally or beyond that. That's critical. The collaboration with others that we talked about, which really could be done on a global scale. So really the technology, not just the apps and the platforms that are used, but also the infrastructure that exists within a country, are really important to broadly access, so that everybody can actually, get an opportunity to engage in this.
Yeah, I know as you started to talk about technology, my mind went on how I now use FanLab for a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
work and a lot of collaborations and actually getting the high quality that I need. And I know a lot of local artists and musicians, they actually transport their music from the Bahamas and they would have a US producer
Mm-hmm.
or studio actually assist them with getting that high quality, that would be accessible.
Right. Because
So,
we have the ability to do all kinds of amazing things on a laptop now that doesn't require a full studio. But if you don't have the sort of the internet infrastructure, or the equipment in place, and I'm sure not everybody, in a developing country just has a laptop sitting at home, giving them a central place, a small studio, a recording rehearsal space, somewhere they can go to do some of these things. It's great that they're able to get, as you were saying, some of their stuff to a US, based producer to be able to handle it. But wouldn't it be great if they could also do it more locally?
themselves, yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for this information. I'm sure that I learned a lot myself, and I'm sure that our listening audience also learned quite a bit. Now, can you let us know how can we access you or be able to reach out to you? I know that I found you from those wonderful newsletters that you write and post on LinkedIn. Yes, they're amazing, and they're very
Thank
informative for
you.
those. You're welcome. They're very informative for those, who are avid readers and they're into research and would like to know more to develop themselves and the community that they share too. But please let us know how else can we find you, how can we reach out to you and find your services as well?
Of course. So I do have a website. It is equalizerconsulting.com. equalizer as in like a music mixer. So equalizerconsulting.com. And I'm also, you can find me on LinkedIn under Natalie Jacobs or Equalizer Consulting. I do have my business page on there too. But I also have an Instagram, which is at Equalizer Consulting. And that is an area where I actually put up little like tips and tricks about metadata and things that, you know, as an artist, you should think about. So, you know, I love using that platform as a way to reach musicians and artists directly. Some of the things that they should consider. So please, happy for anybody to give me a follow.
Yes, I'm sure I will reach out to you, and I'm sure others will as well. And thank you so much for this, Natalie. It was a wealth of knowledge, and
Thank you so
thank
much for
you.
having me.
Yes, you take care now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you too.